Good evening and welcome to a Wednesday night Bible class at Lakes Region Church of Christ. Tonight we're going to be recapping a little bit in Isaiah chapter 3 so that we can kind of keep the context. As we look through this, we brought up the point, the innuendo of vain and worldly women, which is brought up in chapter 3 verses 6 through 4, to chapter 4:1. And the prophet denounces Judah's women because the daughters of Zion were proud and haughty. You can see this in verse 16. Of chapter 3, when we read this, he tells us here, he says, moreover, the Lord said, because the daughters of Zion are proud and walk with their heads held high and the seductive eyes, and go along with mincing steps, tingling and bangles on their feet. Now, it's interesting as you look through this, the daughters of Zion are proud, they're haughty, they're arrogant. They walk with their heads held high. They have seductive eyes, mincing steps. You know, this is actually talking about short, choppy steps. They're playing the coquette here. And tinkling and bangles on their feet. This is excessive wealth. It's designed to draw attention to them. They were overdressed with jewelry and for the express purpose of drawing attention to themselves. Now, he tells us as we continue on here that these women are going to be punished in several ways. And he begins in verse 18, that the Lord will take away their beauty, and then he goes through a whole extensive list here of all kinds of things that have to deal with, basically with feminine finery that are going to be removed. This is an extensive list. Read through it. I'm not going to go into all these things. There's several things that are mentioned here, and this was what was going to happen to them when the nation was going to be overrun. Then as you continue on down here in verses 24 and 25, they will become widows, their men will fall in combat, they'll swap their feminine finery, as it tells us here, for sackcloth and mourning. In verse 26, and the gates will lament and they'll mourn, and deserted she will sit on the ground. And it talks about this, there'll be mourning, sackcloth. Now, when you get over into chapter 7, verse 1, it tells us the result of all this, because of these men that are going to be, the nation is going to be decimated, and the men are going to be decimated, and the women will resort to polygamy, so as to prevent the shame of not having a husband. It tells us here in 4:1, a very, very strange verse. In here it says, for 7 women will take hold of one man that day, saying, we will eat our own food, our own bread, we'll wear our own clothes, only let us be called by your name, to take away our reproach. Now, and we have that musical called 7 Brides for 7 Brothers, and here we got 7 brides for 1 brother. Kind of a real strange thing, a terrible decimation that's going to come upon a nation. Now we get into chapter 4, and chapter 4, verse 2, we have the introduction of the branch. Okay, and as we read here, it says, in that day, this is going back to chapter 2, verse 2, talking about the same day, the day that God was going to set up his kingdom, and that day the Lord, the branch of the Lord will be beautiful and glorious, and the fruit of the earth will be the pride and adornment of the survivors of Israel. This is talking about the remnant here in this passage. Now, there's also several other passages that talk about the branch. If you go over to Isaiah chapter 11, we're going to look at verses 1 and 10. Isaiah 11, 1 and 10. We read here in Isaiah 11, and the shoot will spring up from the stem of Jesse. And verse 10, and the branch from his roots will bear fruit. And verse 10 also tells us here in chapter 11, in that day the nations will resort to the root of Jesse, who will stand as a signal for the people, and his resting place will be glorious. Okay, now we also have some passages in Jeremiah that we should take a look at. Let's go to Jeremiah chapter 23. Jeremiah 23, just one book over from Isaiah in your Old Testament. And in Jeremiah 23, we read, Jeremiah 23 and verse 5, we read, And behold, in the days are coming, declares the Lord, that I will raise up for David a righteous branch, and he will reign as king and act wisely and do justice and righteousness in the land. In his days Judah will be saved, and Israel will dwell securely. Now this is talking about the whole nation here. And his name will be, his name by which he will be called the Lord our God, or the Lord our righteous. Now also, if you turn with me over to Isaiah chapter 33, just a few more pages over, Isaiah 33, I'm going to take a look at a few passages here. And it talks about the Davidic kingdom here in Isaiah 33:14. Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will fulfill the good word which I had spoken concerning the house of Israel and the house of Judah, in the days and in the time which I will cause the righteous branch of David to spring forth, and he shall execute justice and righteousness on the earth. And in those days Judah will be saved and Jerusalem will dwell in safety, and his name by which he shall be called the Lord our righteous. And it's a great passage when you think about this. There's also a passage I'll give you. You can go over and check out Zechariah 6:12 and 13. Now, the branch of the Lord is going to be called beautiful here. You go to Isaiah chapter 4, verse 2, beautiful and glorious. And in that day, the branch will be beautiful and glorious. This has reference again, as we said, to Isaiah 2:2. And the fruit of the earth, or the fruit of the land, will be the pride and adornment of the survivors of Israel. Now that tells us that in verse 2, right at the very end here, the survivors of Israel. This is speaking of the remnant. And this only makes sense if you're talking about spiritual fruit. Okay, in the spiritual context here, we're talking about spiritual fruit. Now, the survivors is a description of the remnant. This is he who will be left in Zion. You know, Joseph Alexander Addison said in his commentary on Isaiah, in the preceding verses, they were described by their condition as survivors of God's desolating judgments. In this, they are described by their moral character and by their eternal destination to this character. This is he who is left in Zion and remains in Jerusalem. Now, this passage is found in Joel chapter 2, verses 28 through 33. Joel speaks about this remnant. And now, we continue on here, and these people will be called, in Isaiah chapter 4, verses 3 and 4. There's some things that are going to be called. The Lord will come about. He who has left Zion and remains in Jerusalem will be called holy. Okay, everyone who is recorded for life in Jerusalem. This is everyone who is recorded for life in Jerusalem. Now what we're talking about here, we're talking about a holy people. Now, when you go to the New Testament, Peter uses this phrase exclusively, be holy as I am holy, referencing what God has said. God is telling them to be holy in Leviticus, and Peter quotes this, and he tells the brethren that he's writing to here in 1 Peter to be holy as God is holy. Now you find this in 1 Peter 1 Peter 1:15 through 16, chapter 2, 11 and 12, chapter 3, 15 and 16 is another one that you want to take a look at. Now, he tells us here too, he speaks of the washed. The Lord has washed away the filth of the daughters of Zion and purged the bloodshed. Put a stop to the bloodshed. The washing, we can take a look at Ephesians chapter 5, 26 and 27. Now in conjunction with this, take a look at Titus 3, 5 and 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 11. And then we have the third word here about purged. And it's talking about being cleansed. They shall be holy when the filth of the women and the blood guilt of the rulers is removed. Okay? They have been purged by spiritual judgment and by a spiritual burning, as you read down here. Now we can also see this in Isaiah chapter 1 verse 15. If you turn back to Isaiah 1:15, he talks about the purging here in this particular passage. Isaiah 1:15 says, "So when you spread your hands in prayer, and I hide mine eyes from you, and even though your prayers multiply, you listen, your hands are covered with blood. And he's talking about purging themselves of this blood guilt. Now also in Isaiah chapter 3, we look there, we're going to look at verses 14 and 15 in Isaiah 3. And it says, "The Lord enters into judgment with the elders and princes of the people. It is you who have devoured the vineyard." They had devoured the nation. And he goes on to say, "You plundered the poor in his house, robbed the poor in his house. What do you mean by crushing my people and grinding the face of the poor, declares the Lord God of hosts." And this was another thing that was brought against them, that they had to be purged from. The abuse of the rulers, the bloodshed that was brought by the rulers, and these other things that are mentioned here. Now, when you look at these three things, you look at holiness, or washing and purging, these are all prerequisites to their character. These things had to be done. The character of holiness and righteousness. And we look here in Isaiah chapter 4 verses 5 and 6. We see that God will protect the remnant. He says, "For the Lord will create over a whole area of Mount Zion and over all her assemblies a cloud by day and even smoke and brightness by night." And this is referencing Shekinah glory back in Exodus in the Old Testament, where God protected the people. He guided them, protected them. And even smoke and brightness and flaming fire by night, and overall glory will be a canopy. He's talking about his providential protection, his protection that he'll put over the remnant. We look at this figure of Mount Zion, and another passage that comes to mind would be Hebrews chapter 12, 18 through 24, what I had always referred to as the tale of two mountains. Dickens had the tale of two cities, and the writer of Hebrews has the tale of two mountains in there, comparing Mount Sinai to Mount Zion in his writing. And Mount Zion is symbolic, the dwelling place of God, and we see this, and this is where the holy city of God is. Okay, now we look further on down here in verse 6, "And there will be a shelter given and shade, heat from day and refuge and protection from storm and rain." Now, this is the Messianic age. This is the church of the firstborn. You go to Hebrews chapter 12, verse 23, and that's what we're talking about here. This is God's remnant. God will protect the church, his remnant. And there'll be a remnant left after this is over, but the remnant that we're looking toward would be God's remnant, which is in here, but it's also found in the New Testament. And the remnant's a fascinating study. Okay, so let's get into our outline of chapter 5. In chapter 5, we have the illustration of the vineyard. And we also, in the New Testament, Jesus uses this illustration in his teaching. But in this, normally that's included with chapters 2 through 4, but we kind of separate it out, put it by itself. This is an image. The image is the song of my beloved in his vineyard. You look at this in verses 1 through 7. It says, "Now let me sing for my well-beloved the song of my beloved concerning his vineyard. My well-beloved had a vineyard on a fertile hill, and he dug around it, removed stones, and planted it with the choicest vine. And he built a tower in the middle of it, and he also hewed out a wine vat. Then he expected to produce good grapes, but it produced only wild ones, or bad grapes, worthless grapes, grapes that were useless. And now, O inhabitants of Jerusalem and men of Judah, judge between me and the vineyard. What more was there to do for my vineyard than I have not done in it? Why then I expected it to produce good grapes, did it produce worthless ones? So let me tell you what I am going to do to the vineyard. I will remove its hedge. This hedge was designed to protect the vineyard, and it will be consumed. I will break down its wall, and it will become trampled underground. and I will lay it to waste, and it will not be pruned or hoed, and the briars and thorns will come up, and I will also charge the clouds to rain no more on it. Now God's talking about the nation of Israel here. He's talking about his people. Okay? And the vineyard was worked and nurtured. Okay? And you can see the work that, he's talking about working and nurturing it for the purpose of producing good fruit. He was talking about good works. But God expected good works, but only worthless wild grapes or wild things were produced. The wild grapes equal evil works. Rebellion, we're talking about idolatry, we're talking about unrighteousness here in verses 1 and 2. And God calls them to judge between me and my vineyard. Judge between me and the vineyard and tell me what more could I have done, is what God's asking him here. He's done everything for them, he provided everything that he could, and yet they were bent on producing wild grapes or producing evil works, doing evil things. And God says, well, who's right in this instant, me or the vineyard? What more could God have done to ensure the production of good produce? What else could he have done? We can ask the same question today in our world. What does God, what more could God do for this world today? This also applies to us. Applies to the Lord's church, because sometimes the Lord's church doesn't do what it should be doing. And we as Christians aren't doing what we should be doing. So we have to kind of, we can make a spiritual application of this. It's good. God has provided to the extent, as much as he can. There's nothing left to do except, judgment and punishment, as we see in verses 5 through 7. Down in verse 7, for the vineyard, the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel. He tells us what it is. This is Israel. We're talking about Judah and Israel together, the nation of Israel. And the men of Judah did delight plant. Thus he looked for justice, and behold, bloodshed. For righteousness, but behold, a cry for distress. And God's going to remove this protective hedge. His providence, the result will be destruction, be trampled down, and it'll just be laid waste. You think about this, you have a garden or a crop that you expect, and the fence is taken down, and it's just trampled down, laid to waste. There's no way to protect it. And God will withhold his providence. It tells us in verse 6, the vineyard is clearly defined, as we said in verse 7, as the northern and southern kingdom. Now, as we continue on down here in verse 8, we see the iniquity of the vineyard and the 6 woes, beginning in chapter 5, verse 8, going down through verse 23. Now, we know the 7 woes that are in Matthew 23, but here we have Isaiah's 6 woes. And we look at the first woe here, beginning in verse 8, woe to those who add to the house and join the field until there is no more room, so that they have to live alone in the midst of the land. Now, he's talking about these land barons, these herbaceous land barons. They're not satisfied with their own land. It's like the guy said, I don't want the whole world, but I just want the land next to mine. And as it goes on, you can keep seeing how this this continues on, and the land next to his becomes the land next to his, and it goes on and on. But they went after the land, and they wanted all the land around them, and their houses were empty, and the houses are going to be empty, and the land will produce a small amount. We look down through verses 8 and 10, and he talks about how much is going to be produced. Not much. This is just a minimal amount. I mean, you think about the kind of bounty that the land can produce, and this is just a scratch of what it can do. It's going to be cursed to the point where it's going to be very unproductive. And then the second woe begins in verse 11, and actually runs down here for a ways. Woe to those who rise up early in the morning, that they may pursue strong drink, and who stay late in the evening, that wine may inflame them. And you think about this and what people do. And now someone who starts drinking in the morning has got a real problem. Those who rise up early in the morning, they pursue strong drink. Well, there's an issue there, a serious issue. These are those who partake in dissipation. Those who this illustrates a severe problem, as we said. Therefore, my people will go into exile for their lack of knowledge, and their honorable men may be famished, and their multitude is parched with thirst. And he's talking about the thirst for wine. And they are also captive in their sin. If you think about it, they already are captive in their sin, and it's the same way with people today who fall into sin. They're captive in their sin. They're slaves to it. Their glory, he's talking about here, will be swallowed up in death and devastation in verse 14. Now, he gives a third woe here, down in verses 18 and 19. If you turn over there with me to verses 18 and 19 of Isaiah chapter 3, the third woe is, woe to those who drag iniquity with cords of falsehood and sin as a cart and ropes, those who say, let him make speed, let him hasten his work, that we may see it. And let the purpose of the Holy One of Israel draw near, come to pass that we may know of it. Okay, now what's being talked about here is that these are deliberate sinners. You know, over in Numbers chapter 14, there's a section there, verses 24 through 22 through 24, where God talks about how they deliberately tempted him. And that's what's going on here. These are people who deliberately tempt the Lord, who say, let him make speed. Let him come, is what they're saying. Let him hasten to his work, that we may see it. They're tempting God to come. In verse 19, you know, when you think about Matthew 27, 38 through 40, let's actually take and go with it in Matthew 27. We're going to read Matthew 27, 38 through 40. Matthew 27, verse 38 tells us, and at the time 2 robbers were crucified with him, one on the right and one on the left, and those passing by were hurling abuses at him and wagging their heads. Who are you who are going to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days? Save yourself. If you're the Son of God, come down from the cross. In the same way the chiefs, priests, and also the scribes and the elders were mocking him. Now you think about this. They were actually tempting Christ to come down off that cross. And here they're doing the same thing. They're tempting God to come and to do what God was going to do. And they had no respect. And sin, as if a cart of ropes, when you read this in this passage, it's an illustration. The beast of burden roped to a farm cart. Iniquity was the encumber they dragged around in their worthless delusions. And sin, the cart which, you know, they were joined to. Then over in Isaiah chapter 5, we have a fourth woe. And this woe is in verse 20. It says, woe to those who call good evil and evil good, or evil good and good evil. Now you think about this, how this is all twisted up and mixed up. And it's just confusing, and that's what people do today. They call the truth not the truth, the truth is not the truth, and the non-truth is the truth, and the truth is anything you want it to be. And this is just confusing. And there are those who are morally befuddled, those who are incapable of moral delineation. They can't tell the difference. They don't want to. And this is a perversion of the truth. They call evil good and good evil. You think about how perverse and how twisted this is. Now we have a fifth woe, which is mentioned. I think I am done. It's blinking. Okay. Is that about right? I didn't hear it ping, but it's blinking.
You're probably recording voice notes.
Still going, is it? Oh. this stuff.